This is something of a homecoming for Richard Schmalensee. Dick was on the faculty here in the 1970s, and then in 1977, his alma mater called him back to join the faculty at MIT. There he is now the John C. Head III Dean and Professor of Economics and Management at the Sloan School of Management. Dick is a prolific writer, is the author of 9 books, and he was very prominent publicly quite recently as an expert witness for the defense in the Microsoft antitrust litigation. And, you know, the MIT guys believe in keeping things in the family. The opposing expert witness on the other side was Dick's former teacher, Franklin Fisher of MIT. So it was a neat arrangement. Dick's government service, as part of the reason he's here today, in 1989 to 1991, Dick was a member of the President's Council of Economic Advisors in the first George Bush administration. Brad DeLong is a professor of economics at UC Berkeley. He's co-editor of the Journal of Economic Perspectives, a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. He publishes extensively, is a prolific writer, and Brad is one of the few economists you can follow day to day. Brad has a devoted audience on his website, www.jbradforddelong.net. Brad's web fans are a passionate crew. Brad served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Economic Policy from 1993 to 1995 in the Clinton administration. His activity there included helping write the 1993 budget, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the Healthcare Reform Plan. We've got 2 speakers today. The format's going to include prepared remarks, an opportunity for reply, and question and answers. And now, please join me in welcoming Dick Schmalensee and Brad DeLong to the UCSD Economics Roundtable. Brad won the coin toss, and he gets to go first.
All right. Now, there are many Democrats who believe that the creation of Republicans was all a horrible mistake, that it was an example of unintelligent design, shall we say. I'm not that kind of Democrat. That is, I believe that Republicans have their place in the order of the universe, and that in fact Republicans should occasionally be allowed to govern, should occasionally win the presidency, that Republican regimes should be safe, legal, but also rare. And Republicans should be safe and legal because there are a number of things that Democratic administrations find it very, very hard to do. Democrats have a horrible time simplifying the tax code, have a difficult time realizing that the complexities of government regulation can act as a substantial drag on what people do in their daily lives. Democrats are not terribly good at looking at the long term. Democrats have a horrible time being for free trade and have had since the Reagan fiscal policy errors of the 1980s and the last cycle of the extremely high dollar. I'm convinced the unions that imports and exports were a device to rob them of their relatively well-paying jobs. Democrats have a hard time thinking sensibly about energy policy, as the example of Jimmy Carter's presidency and his energy plan serves as a canonical example in every single industrial organization and regulation course in the land. Democrats have a hard time adopting truly sensible environmental policies because they see the harm done by lack of regulation, lack of controls very deeply. I mean, there is substantial harm, but they are, in some sense, have a hard time seeing the harm done by over-regulation in one sort or another. Now, none of these things make me a Republican, I think the Democratic side is on the side of the angels 80 to 90% of the time. But it does mean that Republicans are occasionally necessary so that they can do the things that are good for the country that Democrats have a very hard time doing. As Harry Truman's Secretary of State, the great Dean Acheson, the architect of the post-World War II Western Alliance, always liked to say, the Democrats are a coalition of motley interests. The Republicans are or ought to be a coalition of one interest, the interest of economic liberty and the creation of wealth. And both have their place in the American political system. So I'm here today to say that the Bush administration has somehow gone horribly wrong. I'm here today to say not just that John Kerry is the better candidate for president because he's a Democrat. I'm here to say that John Kerry is the better and George Bush the worse candidate because George Bush is an absolutely horrible Republican. He has failed to do what Republicans were created and put on earth to do in practically every dimension. Wherever you look at the substance of Bush administration policy, it's not only not democratic, it's not even Republican. It's indescribable. Let me focus on a few big fiscal policy issues. The last time I did one of these things, in 2000 at Stanford, where my opponent was Michael Boskin, who had been chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under the first Bush administration. Mike assured me that after Bush was elected, his first priority would be to fix the long-run fiscal imbalance in America created by our entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare. That George Bush would grab the bull by the horns and use the then existing surpluses to grease the wheels of a deal to get America's long-run fiscal resources in balance with the long-run demands that we place on them. And back then, even though I'm very proud of what the Clinton administration did on the budget, the task was not complete. There were then short-term surpluses, but there was a long-term prospective deficit. And the rule of thumb way to think about it was that we then had taxes at 21% of production, and yet in the long run, the promises, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth, that we'd made looked like they were going to take up 25% of production, a fiscal gap of 4%. Mike Boskin said George Bush would close that. Now we have a fiscal gap of 8%, the 4% that we had when Clinton left office, plus an extra 1% from enhanced security spending, an extra 2% from the tax law changes that Bush has put into effect, and an extra 1% of spending that everyone I talk to has a very hard time justifying, the egregious farm bill, and so forth. And when the Treasury and CEA people working for Bush during the past 4 years have tried to get answers so that they can even start drawing up plans for Social Security reform, they send questions to the White House, and nothing comes back. Nothing about the parameters that Bush wishes them to accept or the lines of analysis he wants them to pursue. On the tax side, if you hold constant your path of what spending is going to be, you can't give people tax cuts. All you can do is shift the tax burden around from one class to another, from the present to the future, from the future into the present. Because current spending not covered by current revenues is covered by borrowing. And the bondholders that you sell the bonds to, they want their money back with interest. By keeping the path of expenditures the same and reducing taxes this year, all you've done is you've increased somebody's taxes at some point in the future in some place. You've made the tax system uncertain and risky. And so you certainly haven't done any good in terms of reducing the burden of taxes on the economy as a whole. In fact, you've done a considerable amount of harm. You've crowded out investment in the short run as money that would otherwise have flowed to businesses flows to the government instead. And in the long run, you've made everyone thinking about acts of investment uneasy because they know the taxes are going to come from somewhere and land on something. They just don't know what. A third issue, a third fiscal policy issue. It's John Kerry will say tomorrow night that George W. Bush has the worst employment growth record since Herbert Hoover. And that will be true. George Bush's administration looks like it will be the first during which employment in America has actually declined since the Great Depression. Now, the fact that employment performance has been lousy is not George Bush's fault, right? Presidents do not control the economy, they influence it. The fact that George W. Bush has taken extremely small and extremely feeble steps to try to cushion the impact or fix the problem or compensate for the lousy labor market is, I think, his responsibility and his fault, and the result of a deliberate decision by the White House over the past 4 years to sell its tax policies as powerful employment-generating fiscal stimulus programs, when in fact they're not, when in fact they're exercises in income redistribution accompanied by a small employment-generating stimulus. And not too effective exercises in income redistribution as well. I know that 2/3 of my Bush tax cut I did not get last year because we were AMT'd. And things were worse for my brother, who lost a considerably higher portion. And as I said before, what goes around comes around. The fact that I've paid less taxes over the past 2 years is offset by the fact that I'm going to be paying more taxes in a decade or more, as are all of you, in order to amortize the bonds that George W. Bush's latest round of deficit is causing to be issued. On process, say on the governmental process, the Bush administration has been worse than I would have imagined. One story of which being the way that Richard Cheney disrupted the normal decisions of the National Economic Council because Cheney wanted the steel tariff enacted, and he was certain that the National Economic Council was going to come out nearly unanimously against it, on the grounds that not only was the steel tariff bad economics, it was also bad mercantilism. That is, more people lost their jobs because their employers had to buy higher priced steel, and as a result their products were at a cost disadvantage to foreign competition downstream, then jobs were protected by the steel tariff. And it was also bad politics. The workers whose jobs were protected in West Virginia were outnumbered by the workers who lost their jobs in Ohio. And these economic failures, these are the less serious of the policy failures of the Bush administration. In the past week, we've seen former proconsul in Iraq, Paul Bremer, saying that when he got to Baghdad, he discovered that there were not enough troops. Not enough troops to keep order in Baghdad, not enough troops to guard the borders, not enough troops to guard weapons sites. Had Saddam Hussein actually had any weapons of mass destruction, any terrorist in the world could have come walking into Iraq last summer and picked some up. It was madness, in a sense, to go into Iraq without a plan, without 150,000 Arabic-speaking military police in our tail. Yet they did it. And the Bush administration's line right now is, well, Paul Bremer said we needed more troops, but he's a wimp. The generals on the ground said that we did not. Condoleezza Rice, extremely smart woman, national security advisor, very highly thought of before the Bush administration. Wolf Blitzer asked her earlier this week, after she said the standard Bush talking point that we have captured or killed 75% of known al-Qaeda leaders. Wolf Blitzer asked her, well, how many is that? Did we know about 10 al-Qaeda leaders, or did we know about 100? And she said she didn't know, that she knew it was 75%. But that she, the national security advisor, did not know whether it was 10 or 100 or something else that count was. The latest news from the National Security Council is Condi Rice asked about what are these aluminum tubes to be used for, saying that it is not her job as National Security Advisor, to question intelligence reports or to referee analytical disputes. But what is the President's Chief National Security Advisor's job to do then? Is it to stand on the south portico of the White House as a potted plant, checking intelligence and getting agencies to bang their heads together is the very essence of those jobs. And things seem to be getting worse, right? That only 2 people have been fired from the present White House. And their first National Economic Council chair, Larry Lindsey, who went to work for Bush in 1998 and worked like a dog for him throughout 98, 99, 2000, 2001, before being let go at the end of 2002. And being let go for telling a reporter that the war in Iraq might cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Right? So they fire him for dominating a news cycle with an actual true piece of information. And then there's Paul O'Neill as Treasury Secretary, who also had many faults, but who seems to have been fired for warning George W. Bush that policies to cut people's taxes a lot now run the risk of landing us once again in huge deficits and erasing the surplus that was needed in order to start the process of fixing the entitlement programs. The guys who give bad information and make bad judgments stay. The guys who tell the principals things they don't want to hear that are true kind of go. Now, what is to be done? Well, in the short run, I think what is to be done is to vote for John Kerry. Right? That John Kerry not only has all the natural advantages of being a Democrat over a Republican, Bush has the natural disadvantage of being an extremely lousy Republican, of being off-scale low in policy on practically every dimension. In the longer run, a bunch of you are Republicans. A bunch of you have the power to be influential at some level in the Republican Party. Take it back for people who care about getting policies right. Paul O'Neill thinks that the dominant mode of thought in the Bush administration is what the heck. Nobody really knows for sure what good policies are, and this will please the hard right base. Well, make it very clear that it doesn't please you, right? That you aren't fooled by a tax cut this year accompanied by spending increases that mean that your taxes are going to go up somehow, somewhere, 10 or 15 years down the pike. That you aren't pleased by signs saying the mission has been accomplished and major combat operations in Iraq have ended, if it comes accompanied with no plan to win the peace and with an insufficient force on the ground so that our soldiers die and are crippled simply because we don't have the people even to reliably and permanently secure the road between Baghdad Airport and the Green Zone. Many of you are what ought to be the Republican base, and they ought to be pleasing you with good policies. And the task is hard, and the task may well be harder than you know. In my kind of pile of stuff, there's a bunch of stuff about Tom Coburn, Republican Senate candidate for Oklahoma. Tom Coburn, who back in 1997 viciously attacked PBS for airing Schindler's List on the grounds that a movie with so much violence and nudity, especially nudity, had no business being shown by public television in anything but the latest of late-night slots. And he was immediately slammed by the then Republican establishment in 1997. Alphonse D'Amato, Jack Kemp, and so forth explained to him that naked people being herded into concentration camps is a very different thing from your standard Hollywood production, and that this was a very important historical lesson and a great movie. But Jack Kemp's out of Congress, Alphonse D'Amato's retired, and Tom Coburn looks like he's going to win his Senate race in Oklahoma, and then be a powerful player in the Republican Senate for at least the next 6 years. But let me stop there.
Okay, let's hand it over to Dick Schmalensee.
Thank you, Russ, and thanks for having me. It's always great to come back to UCSD and to come back to this area. As Ross mentioned, I was on the Council of Economic Advisors for the first 2 years of the first Bush administration. I have my George Herbert Walker Bush presidential cufflinks here as proof of that. Think back about that administration. That administration saw a structural deficit, took a huge political hit for raising taxes to deal with it, obsessively worried about spending during its tenure, passed the most important environmental legislation in a long time in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which were negotiated with Congress. Had a White House conference on climate change, and in the process changed the tenor of international discussions from a vast international regulatory apparatus to a market-based approach. The Clinton administration continued this, and it had a profound impact. I spent a lot of time on regulatory reform in electricity and telecommunications, probably with more defeats than victories, but moving in that direction. That administration tried to move on education and did some moves in the area of welfare reform. On the trade front, you may recall there were terrible fears at that time that the Japanese were eating all of our lunches and we would be flipping burgers forever. And there was a terrible trade deficit with Japan, in response to which the Bush administration held endless discussions with the Japanese about structural adjustment. Period. Endless discussions about structural adjustment. No tariffs. I'm probably a political orphan, I guess, to the extent that I'm partisan. I would be a moderate Republican if there were moderate Republicans. I'm fairly liberal socially. I'm fairly conservative economically in the sense that I prefer market-based approaches to regulatory approaches whenever there is a chance, but I prefer to deal with problems rather than ignore them. There are about 7 moderate Republicans visible nationally if you count carefully. But nonetheless, I have to say, I found the first Bush administration congenial on economic policy, and at the start, I found this president, when he was campaigning, congenial. I worked on the 2000 campaign. The talk of compassionate conservatism, the bipartisan record of accomplishment in Texas, the involvement in that campaign of some people I knew from the prior Bush administration, some of what I thought the more enlightened, progressive, energetic, intelligent people, Josh Bolten, Andy Carr, Condi Rice, et cetera, lots of smart people. But I'm not backing him now. And it's not because the economy's weak. I agree with Brad that you can't blame presidents too much. They influence. I actually think if you combine the spending stimulus with what the Fed did, with the tax policy, which wasn't well designed as a stimulus, the pedal has been pretty much to the metal. And what happens, happens. I don't blame him for that. I do blame him for what I consider just absolutely disastrous foreign policy in Iraq. Just disastrous. But that's not our subject. I'm very uncomfortable with what I would describe as a fundamentalist streak in this administration, which goes from the religiosity to some of the worst aspects of the treatment of civil and human rights, the Patriot Act, the Guantanamo, the Abu Ghraib, the failure to hold anybody responsible for any of this. That's not our subject today. I want to talk about economic policy. Like Brad, I am bothered that the tax cut was just too deep to grow out of. I mean, that's the short answer. They made a tax cut, but that by any standard is too deep to grow out of. Now, Reagan did that in 1981. But then Reagan raised taxes a little bit in 82, in 83, in 84, and through sleight of hand in the Tax Reform Act of 86. People forget this. He brought down the top bracket rate, but he raised taxes several times after that initial huge too huge tax cut. There is no such flexibility here. We're in a situation where our deficits are being financed by the Japanese and Chinese central banks. This is not a terribly comfortable position. It feels okay as long as they're willing to send us goods in exchange for government debt. We can live on this, but it's a very nervous-making situation. Now, what I find shocking, right, the Republican rhetoric since Reagan has been, you cut taxes real deep to starve the beast. Right? That you want to really put pressure because nobody can live with terrible deficits. At least we all used to know that. Nobody can live with long-term structural deficits. So you cut taxes and that forces a cut in spending. What's shocking is this administration has absolutely not restrained spending. Now, obviously defense spending had to go up. Taxes go down. And entitlements via Medicare went up. You would think that a responsible administration would restrain other spending. Under Clinton, non-defense discretionary spending rose at 4.1% a year. Under Bush, 8.6%. If you recognize that inflation, because of the soft economy, has been lower in the Bush administration, the contrast is even more dramatic. It's not clear the best way to do the adjustment, but a back-of-the-envelope adjustment gives about 1.5% inflation-adjusted increase in discretionary non-defense spending under Clinton and about 6% under Bush. Much more spending in a Republican administration, discretionary spending. Now, you point to, the obvious thing to point to is Homeland Security, and indeed that's gone up. But of the roughly 125 billion increase between fiscal 2000 and fiscal 2004, about 20 billion of that is Homeland Security, if you look at the latest CBO analysis. So it's not Homeland Security, it's everything else. And if you recall Bush's acceptance speech at the Republican convention, go back and look at the transcript, which you can find on the web. The tax cuts are to be made permanent. There's more spending for job training. There are tax cuts for opportunity zones, tax credits for health savings account, more for health care, particularly in rural areas, and on and on. So what a good conservative Republican does is cut spending under these conditions, and what this administration has done is to spend more and more. We could come back to talking about his proposals for Social Security, but net, they call for either higher taxes or lower benefits. And I think the answer has to be higher taxes. In a wide range of other policy areas, this administration disappoints because it's been unwilling to make tough choices or push reform. In trade policy, for more than 50 years, U.S. presidents in both parties led the world to a dramatic increase in international trade with a concomitant increase in economic welfare around the world. Clinton did NAFTA despite the opposition of many in his party. Bush imposed steel tariffs that clearly violated our treaty obligations and clearly encouraged protectionists to buy a few votes in Pennsylvania. He signed an absurdly bloated farm bill that roughly doubled agricultural subsidies, despite a fairly long-term bipartisan move toward reform pushed by presidents from Reagan to Bush to Clinton. Why do I say that in the context of trade? Because the current round of trade talks are heavily about agriculture. And they're heavily about the ability of poor countries to compete with subsidized exports from rich countries. This farm bill almost scuttled those talks, and the only thing that's kept them going is a promise this administration has made to someday cut farm subsidies in half. No one I know who is close to the situation believes that promise is even remotely credible in this administration, and that's a very sad thing. Now, I was involved in the campaign on the environment side. I had worked in the first Bush administration, continued to work, have written on the issue of climate policy. And I advised this administration, mea culpa, I advised this administration to call a spade and declare the Kyoto Protocol dead. After all, there had been a 95-0 vote in the Senate basically opposing its basic structure. I view the Clinton administration as having been irresponsible to negotiate something that plainly could not be ratified. What was exactly the point of that? I said, look, the next step is to just call the dead horse dead and start to negotiate and propose an alternative. So what the administration proceeded to do was to walk away from the treaty and pretend the issue doesn't exist. That's just not responsible. That's just not responsible. In other areas, the administration has a clear skies proposal, which is actually not a terribly bad proposal, but there's clearly, on air pollution, there's clearly no intent to enact it. It's simply there to have an answer to the environmental movement. So no attempt to really reform environmental policy. Most action on the regulatory front, there's some complicated issues, has not been positive. The energy bill was a pork roast. It's had something for everybody. The traditional role of a Republican administration in energy policy, and we did actually play it, much to painful as it was, is to say the best energy policy is to make markets work better and to stop subsidizing everything that everybody can think of, because the government isn't very good at developing new commercial technologies, and to try to enable and do basic research. This administration instead proposed lots of pork for lots of people. And there's been no progress on electricity, despite the need for the clear need for a federal framework to deal with electricity markets that, as you know well, are not limited by state borders. One statistic stands out as a summary of how this administration has governed. Normally, congressional parties are more ideological than the president of the same party. Congressional Democrats are more liberal than Democratic presidents. Congressional Republicans are more conservative than Republican presidents. So they tend to pass bills that the president, concerned sort of with the center, finds uncomfortable. Similarly, appropriations committees tend to be captured by the interests they deal with. So the Ag Committee is too generous to farmers, the Defense Committee is too generous to the Pentagon, and so forth. For all those reasons, presidents veto bills, typically, even when their party controls Congress. So Kennedy and Johnson together vetoed 51 bills over 2 terms. That's 25 a term, even though the Democrats controlled Congress the whole time. Carter, in his 1 term, vetoed 31 bills. He also had a Democratic Congress. It's a little rockier when there's congressional opposition. The first Bush administration vetoed 44 bills. This president has vetoed 0. No spending bills. No bills that he finds too conservative for his taste coming out of a strongly conservative Congress. 0. This president, unlike his father, has not governed from the center. He has governed from the right. John Kerry is my senator. John Kerry is not perfect. We could go through his blemishes. He's a traditional Democrat, loves to spend. I think he loves to regulate. He hasn't grappled seriously with Social Security, which is the training problem. The serious problem is Medicare. But to ask him to do that in a campaign is a little much. And his Senate record isn't terrific. And I don't think the Bush administration has been completely a disaster. The No Child Left Behind bill, though imperfect, is real and needed reform in education. Moving away from the double taxation of dividends in isolation is not a bad thing. There's some good aspects to some of their environmental proposals. But on balance, I think the choice is between a liberal Democrat, perhaps too liberal for my taste, who at least tries to think through issues, and a very conservative Republican who governs not from the center, but from the right, who has made disaster after disaster in policy area after policy area, and doesn't seem capable, on the evidence we have, of running a thoughtful, improved policy. There are a lot of smart people in that administration and not great policies coming out of it. So if you care about economic policy and you are not a yellow dog Republican, I think this is a reasonably easy choice, if not necessarily a pleasant one. Thank you.
Do you, either of you feel like replying to the other?
Oh, yeah, I'll reply.
Yeah.
Well, first, I think that Dick is largely wrong when he says this is a president who has governed from the right. He's governed from the kind of cultural conservative, right? That's true. He hasn't governed from the foreign policy right, which likes to apply American power hard around the world when it is necessary. He's governed from somewhere beyond Pluto, where you simply show up and announce that Iraq has been democratized without taking any steps to actually spend the money that Congress has appropriated, or control the city of Baghdad so there's no looting afterwards, or hold quick elections so that people learn the road to political influence is getting people to vote for you rather than showing you can put people with AK-47s on the streets of Fallujah. Our policy in Iraq is not a conservative policy. Our foreign policy is not a conservative policy. It's a Plutonian policy. And although I'm a Democrat, I've been brainwashed enough by the disciples of Adam Smith to have a bunch of attraction for the economic libertarian right. And anyone who's served in government has a keen awareness of the potential magnitude of government failure, and can say that even if you like much of what the government does, someone governing from the libertarian economic right saying, is this a core state competence? No, let's get rid of this program. Are these taxes laying too heavily upon, or is the long-run tax burden laying too heavily upon the country? Yes, let's cut them back and find some places to cut back spending too. That can be extraordinarily productive. But Bush has not governed from the libertarian economic right. He has governed from the economic gamma quadrant, where he says to Congress, give me my tax cuts and pretend that they're responsible, and I'll give you your spending increases and pretend that they're responsible too. If only we did have had a president who had governed consistently from the right over the past 4 years, I think we'd be in considerably better shape.
Brad makes good points. I withdraw. I will simply say he did not govern from the center or consistently from the libertarian right. The question is, where do you think the neocons are? You put them in Pluto. I would have put them somewhere on the right flank, but we can argue about that. You're right. It is difficult to ascribe any. It's difficult to find a consistent philosophy behind much of the economic policy.
Okay, well, as moderator, I'd like to bring a little more Republican tone to this discussion. So to our panelists, let me remind you that Greg Mankiw is chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for the Bush administration now. He's professor of economics at Harvard, author of a leading elementary textbook in the field. So, question to each of you: if Greg Mankiw were here in a few minutes, why don't you tell us what he would be saying?
Well, I talked to Greg Mankiw yesterday morning, in part because I thought I would like to know. And what Greg would say, is that Kerry will be worse, right? That you can say that the Clinton administration had an extremely responsible and growth-oriented fiscal policy, but that depended upon crucial political victories won in the early stages of the administration. By Bob Rubin, by Lloyd Bentsen, by Leon Panetta, by Bill Clinton himself, to set the administration on the track of saying that deficit reduction in order to try to create a high investment recovery is job one. And that maybe in a decade, if we do get the budget deficit under control, if we do get a high investment recovery, if that high investment recovery is accompanied by rapid productivity growth, then there'll be the resources to satisfy some of the core Democratic constituencies. And what Greg would say is that when Kerry takes office, the core Democratic constituencies, at the teachers' union, say the old industrial unions, the trial lawyers, and so forth, are going to come and say, we've been waiting for a decade. You had your chance in Clinton from 92 to 2000. It's time to be not new Democrats, but old Democrats again. And that Kerry will not want to or will be unable to resist them. My reply to that is that I don't think that's the way it's going to turn out. Certainly the Bob Rubin faction of the Democratic Party will fight like dogs, or perhaps will fight to put leashes on the dogs of Democratic spending. But I do agree that it's hard to say in advance what anyone's presidency is going to be like. We have a choice between a Democrat who seems like more or less a normal Democrat and a Republican who is so far off the scale as far as policy is concerned to be something that I have a hard time describing.
Greg Mankiw, a question.
Well, I think, first of all, the role of the Council of Economic Advisors in both Republican and Democratic administrations is, in a sense, leaning against the wind. In Democratic administrations, the Council typically says no, and in Republican administrations, the Council even occasionally argues for action. So it's, you would not expect Greg in candor to fully subscribe to everything in this administration, nor although he will in public. Look, what he would say is exactly that. He would say, you worried about the deficit, and you want to elect Kerry? Go to Kerry's acceptance speech and his stump speech and look at the spending initiatives. And while Kerry does say he's going to do some tax increases, it's not obvious that a Republican Congress will pass them. But as we've seen in the last 4 years, the Republican Congress will gleefully pass spending increases and has done so with abandon. So in a Kerry administration, fiscal policy will be worse. Regulation, the Bush administration hasn't re-regulated much, but a Kerry administration might. There is that regulatory impulse. And education reform is opposed typically by teachers' unions. Teachers' unions are a core Democratic constituency. If you're worried about education reform, you would worry about a Kerry administration being, you don't like No Child Left Behind, it could go away. There could be no pressure on schools to measure performance, et cetera, et cetera. So in a whole set of areas, Kerry could be worse. But again, to echo Brad, it's really hard to predict. I must say I was astonished by what this administration did, because it didn't look like this going in. And I think Kerry has shown that he is at least thoughtful. He also has a good team, and frankly, we have the record of this administration before us, and it is not a record that deserves support. I would try something new.
Let me say I got a little carried away while channeling Greg back there and forgot to give what was my answer to Greg yesterday on fiscal policy, which is that Kerry is committed to restoring the kind of institutional framework of fiscal discipline, that worked so very well in the 1990s, and that was, in fact, what I think of as the single most powerful accomplishment of the George H.W. Bush administration. The Budget Enforcement Act, which requires that when Congress thinks about spending, it thinks about taxes too. That bills that will increase the deficit are automatically out of order on the floor of the Senate. That every plan moving forward has to include, along with it, some provisions that say this will indeed be paid for. And I think if you can restore that structure of fiscal discipline to Congress, all of a sudden you'll find Congress behaving very, very differently. Right? That while there aren't necessarily 50 votes in the Senate to oppose spending Bill X, there certainly are 50 bills to oppose waiving the framework of fiscal discipline for Bill X. And so that had the Budget Enforcement Act not been allowed to expire 4 years ago, were it restored, I think we would see a very different Congress.
Well, one can hope. One can hope is what I said, yeah.
To start off the Q&A, we've got Professor Michael Noel of UC San Diego.
John Kerry advocates a policy of importing cheaper pharmaceuticals from Canada, which ironically is an example of outsourcing. Number one, why would the Kerry administration believe that pharmaceutical companies would continue to supply drugs to Canada and other countries at the same prices that they do now, and supply them in vastly larger quantities, knowing full well that those drugs will compete with their domestic version? And number two, if such a policy ever worked, what would be the ramifications on research and development of drugs in this country?
Can I jump? I think it's not without reason that people refer to campaigns as the silly season. I think the whole Canadian import discussion is basically a bipartisan ducking of what is actually a very serious problem. And this administration, to its credit, at least some voices in this administration have tried to raise this issue, the past director of the FDA, a commissioner of the FDA in particular. Look, those drugs aren't being imported from Canada, they're being re-imported. They're made in the US, sent to Canada, and then brought back. And they're cheap in Canada because Canada, like most other countries in the world, regulates the prices of drugs. They are negotiated with the drug companies. Ironically, generic drugs are a lot more expensive in Canada than they are in the US because Canada has a generic drug industry that it protects. So Canadian generics don't face competition. And Canadian consumers pay about twice what Americans do for generics. But let me put that to one side. The problem that no one is grappling with, and frankly I think this is because no one quite knows what to do about, is it's clearly not tenable to have a situation in which U.S. consumers pay much higher prices for drugs than people in most other parts of the world. U.S. consumers will figure this out, have figured it out. The Canadian business is only one possible response. Another possible response is Medicare price negotiation with the pharmaceutical manufacturers giving us prices comparable to those in Western Europe. If that happens, it follows pretty much as the night the day that incentives to do R&D on new pharmaceuticals get reduced drastically. Consumers save money in the short run. Prices are on the existing set of drugs. The next set of drugs takes longer to emerge. I mean, that's sort of at the level of supply-demand. You reduce the reward to innovation, you reduce the investment in innovation. I don't think anybody has an answer to it. Kerry is just being a populist. The Bush administration isn't doing anything really useful. And the problem is it's an international problem, right? I mean, what you want is some worldwide regime where the cost of developing new drugs is borne in the form of higher prices or some other way, and is borne in some reasonably equitable way among all the developed countries at least. But nobody has the incentive. Nobody wants to be the high-priced country. It's a political disaster. So that's just a messy problem, and I think the notion that we're going to help U.S. consumers by importing drugs from Canada is just a deeply flawed proposal, but it's an inevitable one in the silly season.
Brad, you want to comment?
Well, I mean, I think the more responsible people on the Kerry campaign say that starting the process of importation from Canada is a way of starting the global discussion that Dick wants to see, if only because in the current system, whereby the U.S. consumers pay the high price and thus cover the research and development costs, and all the other developed industrial countries free ride, essentially, trying to negotiate down as close to marginal cost as possible for something that is a powerful increasing returns product. That's a system that we can't sustain inevitably, and that we need to start the process of negotiation somehow. And so importation of drugs from Canada is not only a popular issue in the short run, gee, you're saving consumers, especially those in Vermont and Washington, money, It's not only an individual liberty interest in the short run. What's this government telling me I can't do, telling me I can't buy these drugs over the internet from this Canadian pharmacy, and daring to say it's because they're unsafe? Well, I have cousins in Canada, and none of them have died from contaminated Canadian penicillin yet. But also a way of being statesman-like in the long run in trying to fix the enormous healthcare dilemmas of the next 2 generations. Right? And the healthcare dilemmas of the next 2 generations are absolutely enormous. We are already spending 16% of everything we produce on healthcare. It's clear that that's going up and probably going up by a lot. That is, which would you rather have which would you rather have, an extra year of high quality, healthy life or another 1,000 DVDs? Choice is not that hard. As it goes up, we're confronted with the fact that the healthcare system seems to be unusual among American industries in having very few endogenous incentives to control costs embedded in it. And also that we have very powerful egalitarian impulses that people shouldn't die on the street of things that we can cure just because they are poor. And so trying to get market forces to push for efficiency and cost reduction while preserving kind of our egalitarian beliefs that we're not a society that lets people die in the gutter just because they're poor, combined with the enormous political power of various segments of the medical care industry, whose interests are often opposed to those of the country as a whole, creates an enormous mess and possibly the second most serious after national security public policy issue facing the federal government over the next 2 generations. I'm not a health economist. I did, however, play one at the Treasury for a year because Lloyd Benson and his lawyers needed someone to interpret between David Cutler and Sherry Gleed, the CEA's real health economists, and them. So I spent a year translating what real health economists Sherry Gleed and David Cutler said to the Treasury lawyers. And afterwards, I was so depressed and so horrified at the sheer difficulty of the problems on both an intellectual, a policy, and also an implementation level.
Yeah, I would just say that there's debate about Social Security, but when you look hard at it, Social Security really is the easy problem. It is much, much easier than Medicare and much easier than healthcare generally.
Repeating the question, if there's a Bush re-election, what's the best and worst case scenario of what's likely to come in the next 4 years?
I actually think the recovery continues. I'm not apocalyptic about the economy. I think 4 years is too long to forecast. The issue of the Social Security, the Medicare, the structural deficit are not cyclical issues, they're structural issues. And I think the best case is the recovery continues and we slide gracefully along at high employment for the next 4 years. The worst case is that the Chinese and Japanese central banks say, why are we buying all this debt? This is ridiculous. And they start rebalancing their portfolios to hold more euros. And, the dollar tanks and interest rates go up and inflation rises and we suddenly have a short-term policy dilemma come upon us suddenly. That's the worst case. Is it plausible? I have no idea what motivates their behavior, so I don't know how to forecast it. But that's the worst case, and it could also happen, given the overhang, it could happen with a Kerry presidency.
Well, I would say that the best case is actually a little bit worse than Dick said, that we have that even if we do continue growing, sliding along, approaching full employment, the fact that the federal government is out there taking $500 billion a year in borrowing, say, if we project spending increases along the lines of what we've seen over the past 4 years, that's $500 billion not flowing to business investment. That's maybe 0.5% per year of slower economic growth. You know, it's not something that creates an immediate economic crisis. It is kind of something that worms away at the timbers underneath. And that's going to be happening even in the best case scenario. You know, at the moment, right, I mean, at the moment, we're supporting the current macroeconomic equilibrium, as Dick said, on the willingness of Asian central banks to keep on buying up US bonds, to keep on loaning us money. And the Bank of Japan is doing this because Japan is still in what it regards as economic stagnation and very much wants to export to the United States, so it doesn't want the dollar to lose value, so it buys dollar-denominated assets when they show up on the market. And the Bank of China is even more so, right? That the worst situation for the Chinese Communist Party would be large-scale unemployment in Shanghai and people unemployed gathering in the streets to ask, by what right do these people rule us? Don't they say they're communists? Why do they get to stay in the luxury hotels and travel abroad and live so well? So if you think that political priority number one for the Chinese government is do whatever it takes to keep full employment in Shanghai, then you think that the best case is relatively likely. Except for the fact that the Bank of Japan, the Bank of China, the US government aren't the only players. There's also everyone else in the world who holds assets denominated in dollars and thinks of moving them into euros. And what is needed for the policy dilemma to emerge is not particularly any change in fundamentals, but just a realization by the holders of dollar-denominated assets that this can't go on forever, and that now is the time to get out. You know, that as Alan Greenspan said in his typically convoluted way a couple of testimonies ago, and let me paraphrase because I cannot get it right and obscure enough as hard as I try, that yes, these are long-run problems. But the fact that financial markets are forward-looking means that the long run can appear any day and can appear very, very suddenly. That is, the best case scenarios hope that the long run will be postponed for another 5, 10, 20 years. You know, it may not be. I do know that in the last Argentine crisis, it struck me completely by surprise because I thought Argentina had another 3 or 4 years to fix its deficit before foreign investors decided it was a hopeless basket case. But they came to the conclusion it was a hopeless basket case before I did, and then the crisis was on them, while I still thought they had considerable running room.
Please join me in thanking our panelists, Richard Schmalensee and